Hello Biology 100 students, welcome back to your lecture on the circulatory system. In this second part of the lecture, we're going to look at the other parts of the circulatory system, including the heart and blood vessels. Okay, so we said last time that the circulatory system was composed of three parts. We have the heart, which is going to be pumping the blood vessels, which are the pipes or conduits for the blood to get to where it needs to go, and of course we have the blood itself, which is the connective tissue that helps to carry oxygen, waste products, etc. So last time we looked at the blood, today we're going to look at the heart and blood vessels. So first off, let's talk about the heart. This is the muscular pump that helps to pump the blood throughout the body. And the heart is located in a region called the mediastinum or mediastinum. It's the area in between the lungs. Now the heart itself is surrounded by a fibrous sac called the pericardium. Peri means outside and cardium means heart. And the pericardium actually has a fluid-filled sort of center area in there. And this fluid-filled area helps to prevent friction between the heart and surrounding tissues as the heart beats. Okay, before we go to talk about the heart chambers and things like that, we're going to talk briefly about the major blood vessels that are entering and leaving the heart. First of all, we have the aorta. This is a very large artery coming out of the left ventricle there. Okay, so it's carrying this oxygenated blood to the body, and we'll talk about how that works in a minute. And then we have something called the pulmonary artery. The word pulmonary means it's lungs. So the pulmonary artery is going towards the lungs. General rule of thumb, arteries are going away from the heart, veins are coming to the heart. Okay, and then down here, of course, we have the vena cava. The vena cava is bringing back oxygen-poor blood to the right atrium. So we have a superior vena cava coming from the head and neck, inferior vena cava coming from the trunk and the rest of the body. Okay, then we have something called coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are important because they're actually supplying the heart itself with oxygenated blood for its own metabolism. Even though we have these huge honking blood vessels entering and leaving the heart, they're not directly attached to the heart muscle, so they don't give the heart muscle any oxygen or nutrients. The heart gets its oxygen exclusively through these little coronary arteries which branch off the aorta. All right, while we're on the subject of arteries and coronary arteries, we're going to talk about coronary artery disease, because you've probably heard about this before. So coronary artery disease is a leading cause of myocardial infarction or heart attacks. Basically, as we get older, the coronary arteries become occluded with plaques, and these plaques tend to be associated with sedentary lifestyle, diets that are higher in saturated fat, etc. So if we have an occluded artery like this, we either need to look at lifestyle changes, sometimes balloon angioplasty, or sometimes what we call a bypass graft in order to remove the occluded part of the artery and replace it with a cleaner blood vessel. Okay, onto the heart itself. Now, most of you know that the heart is a muscular pump, and it's made up of cardiac muscle, and that cardiac muscle is involuntary. Now, the heart is also divided into four chambers. The top chambers up here are called the atria, okay, and then the bottom chambers are called the ventricles. The atria are not very muscular. All they have to do is take blood from here and pump it to here. Okay, on the other hand, the ventricles tend to be much more muscular because they're pumping that blood a lot further distance. For example, right here, this is the right ventricle, and it would be pumping to the lungs via this blood vessel right here called the pulmonary artery. On the other hand, the left ventricle is going to be pumping towards the rest of the body via this blood vessel right here, which is our aorta. Okay, so the chambers of the heart are separated by valves. The reason we have valves is that it prevents backflow from the ventricles to the atria as the heart contracts. So it keeps blood going in one direction. So we have first these atrioventricular valves, and on the right-hand side we have the tricuspid, and the left-hand side we have the bicuspid or mitral. The way that I remember which one is which, right and tri both have an R in it. So right and tri, right side is the tricuspid, the left side here is the bicuspid. And you might be looking at me going, hey, Langston doesn't know his left from his right. Well, we always pretend this heart is our heart, so I would be turning this way, and this would be the right side of the heart, this would be the left side of the heart. We're going to do an example here in a minute where it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, so we have valves separating the atria from the ventricles, but we also have valves separating the ventricles from the blood vessels that are leaving the ventricles. And so these are called semilunar valves or half-moon valves. And we have a pulmonic semilunar valve and the entrance to the pulmonary artery, and we have an aortic semilunar valve and the entrance to the aorta. Again, these valves keep blood from going backwards, especially as the heart relaxes. When the heart is contracting during systole, it's forcing blood up the aorta, but when it starts to relax, this blood would want to go backwards. But fortunately, we have these one-way valves that keep blood going in one direction. Okay, we don't teach a lot about how the heart works in a Biology 100 course, but it is important for you to understand how heart circulation works. There's basically two circuits that the heart is feeding, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Pulmonary, remember, means the lungs. So the pulmonary circuit is going to the lungs. So let's take a look right here. This starts on the right side of the heart, and the right side of the heart is receiving blood back from the vena cava. And this was deoxygenated blood. It has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. So the first thing we need to do before we recirculate that is to oxygenate it. So that happens in the pulmonary loop. So we go from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle up to the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery leaves the heart and goes to the lungs. Within the capillaries of the lungs, the little blood vessels, we actually pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. So now you can see that the blood is oxygenated. Okay, now we're going back to the heart. So we're going through the pulmonary vein, back to the left side of the heart, over to the left atrium. So the left atrium has oxygenated blood. That pumps to the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps to the aorta. So now we're in what we call the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit is feeding oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body. So it's a much larger circuit there. It has a lot more work to do. And within those systemic capillaries, we drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. And eventually that blood is transported back to the heart once again by the vena cava. So one thing you should be able to tell me on an exam is how does blood pressure and oxygenation change through the two different circuits? In order to really understand it, you should probably draw this out for yourself. Okay, you probably remember this guy. This is Bob Ross. You probably see him on public access TV, and he's always the one up there painting happy little trees and happy little forests and things like that. Well, unfortunately, Bob Ross is no longer with us, but I'm still around. So in this part of the lecture, I hope to invoke a little bit of Bob Ross's charisma and drawing skill, and we're actually going to draw a simplified picture of the heart circulation together. So what you're going to need is a big piece of paper, maybe 2 or 3 pieces of paper, and then maybe a pen, some colored pencils if you have them, or even crayons. Okay, so I'm going to offer this as an extra credit opportunity. If you do a good job on your drawing and you're proud of it, take a picture of it, upload it to Dropbox, and I will give you 5 points extra credit. I won't add it to your quiz, I'll just add it into your normal grade. So I want to give you a little bit of incentive for doing this here. Okay, first we start out with a clear piece of paper. Clear paper, clear mind. Next, we're going to need a circle. Make it a happy circle. Okay, we have a happy circle. This circle is the heart. The heart is not really circular, but this makes it much easier to comprehend the circulation of the heart. Now let's draw a line down the heart. This line is called the intraventricular septum, and it divides the left side of the heart on this side from the right side of the heart on that side. Now we're going to separate the ventricles from the atria. Bloop. And so what you see here, the atria are up top, the ventricles are down below. Atria tend to be smaller than the ventricles. Now we're going to label them with RA for right atrium and LA for left atrium. Again, if this seems backwards, we're assuming that this is your heart and that you're facing outwards from the screen. Okay, below we have left ventricle and right ventricle. Now we're going to add a blood vessel. The first vessel we're going to add is the pulmonary artery. Now normally the pulmonary artery actually comes out the top of the heart, but that requires some three-dimensional drawing skills, which I do not have. So instead, we're going to draw it coming out of the bottom of the right ventricle. So remember, arteries are vessels that are leaving the heart, and they're usually under high pressure because the blood within the arteries was just compressed within the ventricles. The next vessel in line are the pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary capillaries are tiny little blood vessels in the lungs where we pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. So I've drawn them here as a mesh network. All right, I'm going to stop the Bob Ross voice because it's annoying. So this is where we're going to pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. Now the important thing to point out is as we go through a capillary bed, we do pick up the oxygen here, but the blood is also going to slow down because these are lots and lots of tiny blood vessels, and basically it's a lot of friction in there and it slows blood down quite a bit. So the pressure is going to go down. Now leaving the pulmonary capillaries, we have another blood vessel, and that's called the pulmonary vein. The definition of veins are blood vessels that carry blood back to the heart. So the pulmonary vein is going back to the left atrium. So it is definitely a vein. Okay, we've done a pretty good job at drawing the pulmonary circuit so far. So now we're going to go back and draw the systemic circuit. So what's the first blood vessel we're going to add? We're going to add the aorta. Remember, the aorta is a large blood vessel that carries blood away from the left ventricle. And once again, it's usually at the top of the heart, but for this diagram and just simplicity, we'll show it coming out of the bottom of the heart. So this is going to be the systemic circuit, right? So we have our left ventricle, pumps past our aortic semilunar valve and then into our aorta. The aorta is an artery, and because it just left the ventricle, it's going to be under high pressure because that blood was just compressed in the left ventricle. Now the aorta is carrying blood to the systemic capillaries. Now the opposite process is happening in the systemic capillaries. We should be letting go of oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide. So the next vessel after the systemic capillaries is going to be the vena cava. The vena cava carries blood back to the heart from the systemic capillaries. So once again, we return that blood back to the right atrium. So here you can see the two different loops that we had, the pulmonary circuit over here and the systemic circuit over here. The pulmonary circuit pumped to the lungs and the systemic circuit pumped to the rest of the body. So now that we have our heart diagram done, we're only halfway done at this point. Now we're going to go back and show what the blood flow is and show whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated, and also talk about the pressure. So let's start at the vena cava. The vena cava is bringing back oxygen-poor blood to the right atrium. So I'm going to draw that as a blue arrow. Now, going from the right atrium, I'm going to go into the right ventricle. Which valve am I going to cross? Well, it's on the right side, so it's going to be the tricuspid valve. I go across the tricuspid, I enter the right ventricle, and what vessel do I go through next? Well, I'm going to go through our pulmonary artery or pulmonary trunk. And so the pulmonary trunk, we have to go through the pulmonic semilunar valve first, but then we enter the pulmonary artery or pulmonary trunk. Okay, the pulmonary trunk is still oxygen poor. We haven't picked up any oxygen yet, and that's why the arrow here is still blue. Now, it's important to point out the oxygenation, which is down here. We said it's low oxygen, but it's high pressure. Why is it high pressure? Well, it's high pressure because we just compressed all that blood in the ventricle and generated the pressure as the heart contracted in the process of systole. Now we're going to go through the capillary bed. So what's going to change? Well, as we go through the pulmonary capillaries, we pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. So we go from a blue arrow showing that it was oxygen-poor blood to a red arrow showing that it's oxygen-rich blood. But what happened to the pressure? Well, the pressure went down. Why did the pressure go down? Well, it went from this big honking blood vessel to this myriad of lots and lots and lots of little blood vessels. So the friction of going through all those blood vessels slowed it down and dropped the pressure. So now we have a low pressure blood, but blood that is oxygenated. And that oxygenated blood is returning back to the heart via what blood vessel? Well, it's the pulmonary vein. And this is one that freaks people out. People think that veins only carry oxygen-poor blood, and that's not always the case. The definition of a vein is something that carries blood back to the heart, but this particular vein is actually carrying oxygen-rich blood back from the lungs to the heart. Okay, that oxygen-rich blood now re-enters the left atrium, and we have to go back through the heart again to repressurize that blood before we send it through the systemic circuit. So we go from the left atrium through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. We're still oxygen-rich, and now the left ventricle is going to compress and pressurize that blood once again before it goes in the aorta. So the left ventricle contracts and then forces that blood across the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And the aorta is a very high pressure artery, and it's carrying blood that is also oxygen rich. So high pressure, oxygen rich blood in the aorta. Now where's it going to go next? Well, from the aorta, it's going to go to the systemic capillaries. And the systemic capillaries is a very extensive capillary bed. It's going to all the other tissues in the body. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done, a lot of pressure to be generated. But in the process of going to those systemic capillaries, the tissues are going to drop off their CO2 and take up all that oxygen that you have been transporting. So the blood that leaves the systemic capillaries ends up being a blue arrow because blue means oxygen poor. And what about pressure? Well, what happens when we cross a capillary bed? Pressure goes down. Capillaries are small. They slow down the blood. They depressurize the blood. And so the pressure is low and oxygen is low. And once again, we return to the right atrium with some oxygen-poor blood that's under low pressure. All right, I know that might have been an ordeal for you, but this is a really helpful diagram I found in order for students to understand how cardiac circulation works. So don't just do this once. Do it 2 or 3 times and be able to do it without me talking to you about the steps. Because once you can draw this diagram just without any aids, this will really help you to do well on the aspects of the exam that pertain to cardiac circulation. And there will be several questions on cardiac circulation. Okay, let's talk about microanatomy of cardiac muscle. So we said before that cardiac muscle is striated. It's kind of like skeletal muscle, except the cells are also very, very short. They tend to branch, and they have these things called intercalated discs in between the cells that allow the cells to communicate so that we have the smooth, synchronized contraction of the cardiac muscle. Okay, so we said before that one big difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle is that cardiac muscle is involuntary, and that's entirely true. But what's even more true is that cardiac muscle is also autorhythmic. It has a nodal tissue that will literally generate its own action potentials and cause the heart to beat on its own, even though we sever the nerve connection between the brain and the heart. And so when you see that, those movies where somebody like reaches into somebody's chest and they pull out their beating heart and you're like, oh, that can never happen. Yeah, it could. I've actually seen hearts pulled out of fish and stuff like that, still beating after that fish has been separated from its heart. And it's because this heart is autorhythmic. It has this node tissue in there that will continue to generate impulses even though we've separated it from the brain. Okay, so the conduction system of the heart is kind of complex, and I really just need you to know this one node right here called the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is sort of the pacemaker of the heart because it has the fastest depolarization rate. It depolarizes or forms a sort of action potential about 90 to 100 times per minute. So that's going to be the pacemaker. Now, what is the normal heartbeat per minute? What's a normal heart rate? Probably not 90 to 100. Your normal heart rate for most of us is somewhere between 65 and 80. So why is it slower? Well, the heart in situ is actually connected to nerves from the brain, one of those nerves being the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is sort of the chill out nerve. And it's just like, man, chill out, man. You don't need to beat that fast. So instead of beating at 90 or 100 times a minute, the heart will beat at 70 times per minute. So that nerve helps to slow down the heart. But we also have cardiac accelerator nerves that will speed the heart up in times of need. Anyway, big picture here is that the first impulse happens here at the SA node, and that travels down to the AV node. And that's going to cause contraction over here of the atria. And then it travels down this area called the atrioventricular bundle, okay, in the intraventricular septum. And then it proceeds up the left and right bundle branches. So the way that the heart contracts is it starts to contract over here from the pointy part, the apex, and it goes that way. And that's important because think of it as a toothpaste tube. Where's the opening of our toothpaste tube? It's up here, right? So we want to start contracting from the bottom. If you're a smart person, you go to put toothpaste on the, on your toothbrush. Where do you squeeze from? Do you squeeze from the bottom like a sensible person, or do you squeeze in the middle like a madman? No, you squeeze from the bottom, hopefully. And that gives you efficient contraction and emptying of the ventricles every time the heart contracts. Okay, so there's two parts to heart contraction. There's systole and diastole. Systole is when a heart chamber is contracting. Diastole is when a heart chamber is relaxing. So let's start out here with diastole. Let's say that the heart is already contracted, and now the heart is starting to not contract. It's starting to relax, and as it relaxes, the chambers here, the ventricles, actually expand. And as they expand, they suck blood from the atria. Remember, the left side of the heart has oxygenated blood, and the right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood. So we're sucking this blood from the left and right atria, respectively, into the left and right ventricles. Now what happens during systole? Well, during systole, right, we have our SA node fire and our AV node, and then we start contraction down here. And as we contract, the blood in the ventricles is going to go this way, and that's going to snap our AV valve shut. And that's important because we don't want blood going back into the atria again. And so the blood here from the right ventricle will go to the pulmonary trunk, which goes to the pulmonary arteries, and the blood from the left ventricle will go out through that aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. So big picture here is that systole is contraction of a heart chamber, diastole is relaxation. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about cardiac output. You're going to have to do a little bit of math here, but it's actually fairly simple. So cardiac output is the volume of blood ejected from the left ventricle during 1 minute. And so we really can figure out cardiac output by figuring out how much blood is ejected from that chamber, and that's called stroke volume, SV, and then multiplying it by the heart rate. I will always tell you the stroke volume on a test. You don't have to figure that out. But you just need to know that the cardiac output is simply that stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. So think about what your normal heart rate would be. Let's say your heart rate right now is 80 beats per minute. If I tell you that stroke volume is 70 milliliters, what does that come out to be? So 770 times 80, that should come out to be 5,600 or 5.6 liters. That's close to or even more than your entire blood volume. So what we're saying here is you're pumping your entire blood volume throughout your body in 1 minute. That's pretty impressive. But now think about what happens when you go to the gym. Let's say your heart rate is up around, 120. So it's 120 beats per minute, and we multiply it again, assuming that same 70. So what does that come out to be? So 120 times, what did we say, 70 for the stroke volume. That comes out to be 8,400 or 8.4 liters per minute. So we have this ability to pump more blood in times of need when we're exercising or something like that. And this ability to pump more blood in times of need is called cardiac reserve. And so it enables us to do exercise and things like that and exert ourselves. Now the important thing to know is that our cardiac reserve goes down as we get older. Think about somebody your age and what does it take to tire you out? Well, if you're 18 or 17 or something like that, you probably can exercise for a long time before you get tired. But now come look at your grandmother and just to have her walk to her mailbox to get her mail. She might get winded that way. So somebody that is older tends to have a lower cardiac reserve than somebody that is younger. Okay, now we're going to go back and mention some things about regulation of heart rate. We said before that the SA node is the pacemaker, and normally that pacemaker is firing off at around 90 to 100 beats per minute. However, our heart is not normally beating that fast if we're at rest. And the reason is we have nerves that are coming from our brain that is regulating the heart rate. We have nerves like the vagus nerve, which is slowing the heart down, but we also have cardiac accelerator nerves, which are speeding the heart up. So if something scary happens on TV, or you're going through a roller coaster or something like that, and you're getting all this information from the cortex, it's going to activate your autonomic nervous system and start ramping up your heart and start stimulating your heart and getting it to beat faster and faster and faster. I mean, to me, I can just watch that first-person view of a roller coaster on TV, not even be on the roller coaster, and my heart rate goes up. So that's because we have information from the cortex, and it's routed through our cardiac accelerator nerves, speeds up the heart rate. By the same token, if you start to relax and just be at peace with yourself and breathe in and out, you can actually reduce your heart rate fairly quickly. All right, before we move on to blood vessels, I just want to say something about congestive heart failure. This is a chronic disease that's caused by the heart no longer being able to keep up with the venous return. And venous return was just the amount of blood that's coming back from the vena cava into the right atrium. So given the blood flow, the heart has to be able to pump it out as quickly as it's coming back. But as the heart ages and over time, it can become worn out basically, or even hypertrophic. You would think it would be great to have hypertrophy in a stronger heart, but that's not necessarily the case. A stronger or larger heart becomes actually less efficient because it's more muscular, it's not as elastic. In any case, as the heart deteriorates, what we have is we have blood that backs up either in the left side or the right side. And so if we have left side failure, we have left ventricle failure, that's going to cause blood to pool in the pulmonary capillaries. And when that happens, we have somebody that has a lot of congestion at night. They're always coughing because the blood is taking its time to get back from the lungs back to the heart. And so we get all this fluid coming out in the lungs. Right side failure, on the other hand, manifests itself as peripheral edema. This is where you see people that have those large puffy ankles and stuff like that. And that can be caused by congestive heart failure, specifically of the right side of the heart. Okay, now we're going to go back and talk about blood vessels. We've already mentioned them a little bit, and now we're just going to complete our discussion. So there's three different types of blood vessels we need to talk about: arteries, capillaries, and veins. The definition here is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart, and capillaries are microscopic blood vessels that allow movement of gases into or out of a tissue bed. Okay, we're going to look first at arteries. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. That is the definition. That's all you need to know. Bam! Okay, don't worry about the oxygenation because sometimes we have low oxygen arteries, most times we have high oxygen arteries. Now, arteries are usually thick-walled to withstand high pressure because they're coming out of the heart, they're carrying high-pressure blood, so we have to have a thick wall to withstand that hydrostatic pressure. Now, some arteries are pretty flexible, some are not. The aorta is very elastic, and that elasticity allows it to expand with every heartbeat so that it sort of evens out the blood pressure and we don't have these huge spikes and dips. Now, a good test question about arteries would be, what force is pushing blood through arteries? Well, it's simply the contractile force of the heart. The heart generates that pressure, forces blood through arteries, and that's why they're high pressure. All right, this picture just shows a diagram of the three layers of an artery. On the outside, we have something called the tunica externa. The tunica externa is made up of connective tissue, and this is there to contain the tremendous pressure we have inside the arteries. I like to think of this as like a fire hose. Have you ever seen the fire hoses that the fire department use? It's like this big canvas thing on the outside. Well, there's actually rubber on the inside, and the canvas itself would probably not be waterproof, but the canvas is there to add strength to it so the artery doesn't burst. Okay, the next layer inside is something called the tunica media, and I like to think of this as the meaty tunic because meaty means it's made of muscle, and this is smooth muscle. So the smooth muscle layer here allows the artery to adjust its diameter. It can dilate and get large, or it can constrict and get small. And adjusting the diameter of an artery allows us to regulate flow and pressure. When the artery dilates, we have easy flow but lower pressure. When the artery constricts, we have less flow but higher pressure. And finally, the inside layer here is something called the tunica intima, or inside tunic, and it's made of simple squamous epithelium. It's epithelial tissue, and this is really important because what is inside this lumen? What's inside the cavity of a blood vessel? Well, it's blood, right? And blood has red blood cells and white blood cells, but it also has our platelets and our fibrin. And if this vessel lining is deteriorated, if we have a break in the tunica intima, and all of a sudden the underlying tissue gets exposed, that could start that process called thrombosis or inappropriate blood clotting. Okay, now we're going to talk about capillaries. Now, capillaries are very, very small. They have a teeny tiny diameter. In fact, they're so small that the red blood cells kind of have to eke through there in single file. They're a link between our arterioles, which are tiny little arteries, and our venules, which are tiny little veins. They're composed of a single layer of epithelial cells, and that's because only having one layer makes it a lot easier to move things across that capillary bed. And they're very porous, and porous here just means they're leaky. Now, because they're porous, capillaries serve as basically biological strainers or colanders. They allow things like water and proteins to move across the capillary bed because they're leaky, but they're not leaky enough to let the red blood cells or white blood cells cross. So they're basically forming a type of filter. Okay, so here you can see a capillary blood vessel right there, and it's very teeny tiny, one cell layer thick, and again, red blood cell would be about that size, so it would sort of have to go through there single file. And by having a small blood vessel, we have lots of surface area, and remember, the walls of the blood vessel are very wet. They're very leaky, so that facilitates movement of things across that capillary bed, because that's the function of capillaries, is exchange. Now, while we have this great picture up here, I'm going to talk about something called vasomotion. So vasomotion is the intermittent allowing of blood into these capillary beds. As it turns out, blood is not always uniformly going through these capillary beds. Down here in this sort of arterial end, there's actually an area that there's a sphincter that can open up or it can close. So sometimes blood flow is just diverted around the capillary bed, it doesn't go through it. But when we open up those sphincters, blood does flow through the capillary bed. And this can be seen on somebody when they blush, okay? When you say something embarrassing or do something embarrassing, you have this sort of autonomic reflex and all of a sudden you blush, right? And that blushing happens because the capillary beds in your skin that were normally didn't have any blood through them, all of a sudden the hormones or the nervous impulses that result in our embarrassment cause blood flow to move through these capillaries, and that's what we see as blushing. Right, and that's what you can see in this picture here, right? The lower capillary bed has the precapillary sphincters constricted, and so the blood is diverted through a central canal called the thoroughfare channel. It's basically a bypass. However, when those precapillary sphincters open back up, blood can move through all the different capillary beds and then move into the tissues. Okay, now we're going to talk about veins. So the definition of veins here is veins carry blood back to the heart, period. Now, veins can be oxygenated or they can be deoxygenated, so don't use that as a rule. But veins are uniformly also under low pressure. They're under low pressure because veins are carrying blood back to the heart. And where are they carrying blood back from? Well, a capillary bed. And remember, blood slows down and pressure goes down in the capillary bed. So veins don't have to have thick walls like arteries. They can have thin walls because they're under low pressure. They're also larger diameter. And they're larger diameter because we don't have the pressure of the heart here to help facilitate moving the blood. So by having a larger diameter, we reduce the friction of the blood in the blood vessel walls. It's also important for me to point out that veins serve as a large blood reservoir for the body. We have a lot of really big veins in the skin that normally a lot of blood is just sort of hanging out in until it's needed. And when it's needed, we can have vasoconstriction and divert that blood into our core circulation. Now, one thing that the veins have that the arteries don't are one-way valves. Think back to the heart. What were those one-way valves for? They kept blood moving in a single direction, and that's what we have here. Because the blood in the veins is so low pressure and low flow, there's a chance that it's just going to go backwards, right? Think about the blood coming from your feet, coming back up to the rest of your body. If there's no pressure from the heart there to push it, it's going to want to just pool down there. And so veins keep it moving in one direction. Okay, so I've already said that the heart really isn't pushing blood through the veins because we've already lost that pressure in the capillaries. So how in the world are we getting blood back to the heart through the veins if we don't have any pressure? Well, the pressure here is coming through contraction of skeletal muscle. As skeletal muscle contracts, it will inadvertently squeeze on a vein. And because these veins have one-way valves, it will keep the blood moving back up towards the heart. Okay, now let's talk about the layers of a vein. Now, just like an artery, a vein has a tunica externa, a tunica media, and a tunica intima. The tunica externa of our vein here is a lot thinner, but it's still made of connective tissue. It can be thinner because, remember, veins are under low pressure. We then have a tunica media, again made of smooth muscle, and that's still really important for vasoconstriction or vasodilation. And finally in there we have our tunica intima, which is made up of epithelial tissue. But what we can see here are the one-way valves, and that keeps blood going only in one direction. And one-way valves are unique to veins, and they're not found in arteries. So how do we get blood back to the heart? We said that the heart is not pushing the blood through the veins. That pressure has already been lost when we went through the capillary beds. So the pressure moving blood back to the heart is coming through skeletal muscle contraction. As we're moving around or just breathing in and out, our muscles are contracting, and when they do that, they're squeezing inadvertently on these blood vessels, on these veins. And that sort of milks the blood up this direction. Now normally as soon as that muscle relaxed, the blood would go backwards, but remember these vessels have one-way valves and it sort of just keeps blood going in one direction. All right, the big picture here about our lecture on arteries, veins, and capillaries is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart, and then capillaries are sites of nutrient exchange. So there are a lot of different blood vessels in the body, and if you take a 2-semester anatomy and physiology course, you will have to learn many of them. For this class, we're not going to make you do that. Hopefully we can do an activity in lab or in class, but I just do want to point out some of the blood vessels that are in here. A lot of the blood vessels in the body are named for their locations. For example, right here, this is the common iliac artery. What is it named for? Well, it's named for the ilium, the hip bones that are right in here as well. If you go up here, this blood vessel, it's called the subclavian vein. What does subclavian mean? Well, it means below the clavicle, so that's the vessel below the clavicle. And then we get in the arm and stuff like that, we will have blood vessels that are called the brachial artery and vein. Brachial here just means arm, and then axillary means armpit. So the names make sense. We don't just pick the names out of a hat. Most of the blood vessels are named for the regions they're coming out of or the organs that they are supplying. For example, we have the renal artery and vein. Renal here means kidney. Okay, that's going to the kidney. Now, one other vessel I want to point out right here is the carotid arteries. You can feel them on the side of your neck right here. This is a great place to take a peripheral pulse in the carotid arteries. Another place to take it right here is on the radial artery. So find your wrist on the thumb side, and this is your radial artery. You can palpate that and feel it with your fingers. It's also a little bit easier to get right here on the carotid artery. So if you ever have to get a heart rate on the patient, those are your 2 areas that you want to go to. All right, that concludes our lecture on the second part of the circulatory system. As always, if you have any questions you didn't understand, go back and review that part of the lecture again. If you still have questions, send me an email or a text. Talk to you later.